getting going. Africa has started looking at, and in some cases is executing, track rehabilitation projects, and not just like 200 meters, the whole track. In doing so, I've spoken to a couple of people to kind of ascertain, the processes and the right questions an operator should be asking in order to get the end result, which will live up to the expectations of the life cycle and all the rest. One of the key things that are coming through quite clearly is the pre-feasibility or feasibility studies. So firstly, what is a pre-feasibility or a feasibility study? Let's start there.
Let me explain it to you in a bigger context. So when you look at the total life cycle of a project, from, let's say, when it's a dream of somebody or there's a need that starts somewhere. So when the project is complete, it follows a very definite path through the life cycle. So basically what you have is very unique stages. So typically we've got what we call a concept phase. So let's say that you've got a project, any project, where you're pondering the idea, should I do it or should I not do it? Is it the right thing to do, blah, 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 yes or no? So you start up with a concept. And in the concept phase, you basically look at a high level, what are my options? Let's say I've got a mine and I want to export coal or other commodities to a certain port. It's 300 kilometers away, and now I'm thinking, what can I do? What are my options? So you embark on this project life cycle where you say, okay, let's embark first on a concept phase where we can understand on a very high level what is my options. So we look at the cost to either construct a railway line or a road or conveyor or any other option that what I can do with my coal. So you couple to that cost, you also couple a timeline. It's going to cost me, it's going to cost me so much and it's going to take me so long to build. For each option, you look at all the hazards. Maybe there's environmental issues. Maybe there's no-go areas. Maybe there's a fatal flaw in one of the options, But on a very high level, you don't spend too much time on it. And you typically spend, let's say, between 3 and 6 months, depending on the size of the project, on this concept phase. On a very high level, you identify all the options. You put a cost to it. The accuracy is normally, let's say, 50% accurate. Just so you can get a high-level view of, what are my options, what's the considerations, and it's clear to everybody. Then after that, if there's no fatal flaw, you go on to a pre-feasibility study. Every time when you go into the next level of study, you sort of refine your options and you go to more detail in each option. So typically in a pre-feasibility study, you would say my accuracy of my study is something like 70 or 80%. So again, I take all my options and I now look at in more detail, what is the cost, what is the timeline, what is the sort of considerations for each option. And at the end of that phase, my pre-feasibility, I typically sit with something where I have, it can be anything from 1 or 2 or 3 or 10 options. But at the end of my pre-feasibility, I end up with a preferred option. So that is my preferred option when I look at all the options. And now I sit with something that I need to take to the next level, which is my detailed feasibility. A lot of people refer to that as a bankable feasibility because at the end of that phase, you usually can go with a document to a bank and you ask for money. And all the financing institutions have got a checklist and say, have you done this, 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 and this, and this, and they tick it off. And typically when you do a detailed feasibility, you follow a very systemic process to tick off all the boxes to make sure that whoever's going to lend you money have got the comfort that this project, you've done all the diligence in this project to make sure there's no surprises. I mean, we all hate surprises when it comes to projects, because we read in the newspapers all the surprises about the cost overrun. There's a lot of good examples of power stations. So you try and avoid that because, if you're going to borrow money, you must make sure you borrow the right amount of money. And obviously this money that you borrow or the finance is coupled to a business case. And this business case works for a specific reason because I've got a mine, I need to export something, it's going to cost me so much. And if the cost now all of a sudden is double, maybe this project is not feasible anymore. So that's why we follow a process just to make sure due diligence are there. So as I said, so typically the phases are the concept phase. The next phase is a pre-feasibility phase. The next phase is a detailed feasibility phase. And then the phase after that is the execution. And nowadays also after execution, they call this like a maintenance, operations and maintenance period. Obviously, then it's when you operate the mine or whatever the project is that you've done. And then to close out at the end of the project, whatever then that date is. But it's very important. I just came off a call, actually, just before your phone, where, a client can do anything. They can ask anything, obviously, because it's their money, it's their project. But, the right thing is to follow the phases in a project to make sure at the end of the day, you've got the comfort that this project will end up the way that you saw it initially. I mean, there are so many things that can go wrong, and you must make sure that you cover all those aspects. And that's why, I mean, a detailed feasibility can take anything from 6 to 12 months. Typically, in a detailed feasibility, let's say we're going to build 300 kilometers of new railway line. We must go to the extreme where we say, okay, let's do a detailed environmental impact assessment study. There's breaches, we must do proper geotechnical. We must drill and we must do all the geotechnical studies. We must do all the detailed surveys, the topographical studies. All those studies need to be done. And even for the costing, I mean, typically you go out to contractors and you ask them to tender on that. It's not a tender where you're going to award, but it's a tender where you tell them, listen, I need this to finalize my estimate for my feasibility. Because at the end of the day, you're going to sit with a cost estimate and you need to have the comfort that this is accurate. So, I mean, you need to take the time to do a proper study. I can't emphasize this enough. You can't just go on and say, okay, let's construct. It doesn't work that way.
So, Henk, in the real world now, where things have obviously changed to, I think, how things used to be done, 10 or 15 years ago, in today's terms, how have things changed in terms of the feasibility process? I see a lot of companies are looking for funding to do feasibility processes or investigations. I mean, are these feasibility studies not something that the government should actually do before they go out to say we want to build a railway or rehabilitate a railway?
Yeah, Flipper, yes. The answer is yes. I can tell you a lot of private clients, private company, they go to the extreme where they fund feasibilities and they even fund the detail engineering after that, before they commence with construction or the execution, just to make sure that they've got the accuracy. Because if you look at the cost of a feasibility and even the detail engineering after that, it's relatively so small compared to the cost of the project. So it's worthwhile making that investment. It's typically, let's say, 3, 4, 5% of the project cost is what you spend on these type of things. And I won't say it's nothing, but it's very small. So that's why a lot of private companies are making sure that they've done this properly. So governments are obviously, yes, do the same. I mean, I know a lot of state-owned enterprises in South Africa are also putting a lot of emphasis and spend a lot of time and money investing in this project lifecycle processes and entrance this in their own processes internally to make sure that the due diligences are followed in the build up to a project. And when they go to their boards and excos or whatever to ask for money, the questions are being asked. Have you followed this project life cycle to come to this point where you're asking for the funding? And the answer should be yes. We have. Or if we haven't, sorry. We can't afford another major cost overrun on a major project. The country can't. So yes, you're 100% right. They should. How the funding works for that, obviously, is maybe something different. A lot of institutions say, I mean, if you go and look for funding wherever you DFIs or whatever, you can ask, listen, in my project preparation, I want finances to also finance this upfront work of the feasibility. And, a lot of finance institutions actually insist on that because they know that the effort that goes into it is worth their while. At the end of the day, it's a very good investment that they make to fund these studies. Yes. But I must also say to you, just remember when you have got a certain project, which is maybe already built, or you've got an existing railway line or whatever it is, sometimes you can make a decision of implementation without going through this process. Then you need to have the insight, and you need to understand operationally what the decision in the context that you make to go to the execution without following the feasibilities. Because you might have a railway line that's totally in a poor state, and you state an enterprise and you need to rehabilitate the line. I mean, you're not necessarily going to go through a pre-feasibility, feasibility to come to a point to say, okay, let's now upgrade the railway line, because the railway line needs to be upgraded. That's it. But you can still go through a process to understand to what extent should I upgrade it. Should I go heavy accelerate, or should I go light upgrading, or whatever? So there's still a process involved to understand what is the extent of the cost involved or the process.
How do we now make the pre-feasibility, which is obviously key and vital, the whole feasibility? Is there a way to speed it up? And I'm just taking it from the context of we need to get infrastructure projects going at a little bit of a pace in order to get countries back to work. Is there a way to kind of speed up this process without having a whole lot of mistakes in it?
Yes, now you can. I think the good answer is yes. The good news of the answer is yes. And that is, a lot of clients also sort of integrate, let's say, a concept study into a pre-feasibility and say, can you do it as one? Don't go through a gap between the two. But then even in that case, there are different hold points where there's what we call gate reviews, where you go through a process, you review what you've done in a certain period, and then you go into the next phase. I mean, clients can also ask you to do the whole thing in one phase and even include in that, to some extent, as I say, some detail engineering already. But it's a risk approach that they take, where they know, so they sort of ring fence the money that they spend on a certain activity. So it's not lost because, I mean, we get a lot of projects where certain elements of the project you can ring fence and say, listen, without a process, there are certain work that needs to be done. It's emergency, we need to do it. Let's ring fence that certain element and let's execute that. But the rest of the project, let's follow this, as I say, systemic approach to get to an answer. So, you don't cut any corners. I mean, there's definitely ways of how you can fast track these type of initiatives and implementation. And there are good examples of that on a lot of projects that have already been executed in South Africa. Yes, they, so it's not unique. And even in as I call it, the project lifecycle process of companies, they have got, sections where they say, okay, if we need to fast track a certain project, this is the process that you follow. But it's still systemic, it's not cutting corners.
So my last question for you is, and I think you're well positioned to help answer this for me. How do we do feasibility studies for new infrastructure where we're like thumb-sucking volumes? So how are we measuring whether that envisaged piece of infrastructure is actually going to deliver the return on investments based in volumes? What are the key aspects that you guys look at if there isn't anything existing to be a benchmark against?
Philippa, what you do is you do a proper phases of the study, concept, pre-feasibility, feasibility, and then you do a proper business case for that specific project. And a business case means you set yourself certain hurdle rates for investments, for instance. It's financial, where you say, okay, this project needs to achieve this sort of internal rate of return or this type of returns. It's economic, where you say, okay, this project needs to create certain jobs, and you set yourself also the hurdles, unless I create this and this and this. And then you also look at the downstream effects, it's not only this project, but downstream, it can create indirect jobs, it create benefit for other industries, So there's also a very, very clear process that you follow, financial and economic side, to say, this is a project that we need to do, yes or no. I mean, again, it's something that needs to be done. There's for instance, let me give you this example. I mean, there's a lot of initiatives by institutions, even our own company, where they set up a project preparation fund. Let's say you look at 20 projects. Out of the 20 projects, there's probably a chance that you only go to execution of 2 or 3 or maximum 5 of those projects. So after 15 projects didn't make it. Because when you go through the whole process of the technical feasibility and the financial and the economical, you come to a point where you say, sorry, this doesn't make sense, for whatever reason. And then it's a lot of projects. And a lot of financial institutions also do understand that. They're going to invest money. And there's a good chance that this project won't go beyond a feasibility or pre-feasibility. But which is good, because the money that you waste after that is so much. Rather stop at that point and you've only spent 1, 2, or 3% of the money that you would have spent. And other than come at a point where you say, wow, I mean, I'm in this. And once you're in a project, you can't stop, because you have to carry on and finish this thing. Yeah, I mean, you don't want to have a bridge sitting in the middle of nowhere. Although you've seen that a couple of times. But yeah.
We have, yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, but it's the world that we're in. There are very clear and good examples. Companies are, as I say, have got very well-established systems and procedures. The only thing is, obviously you're spending money on a feasibility, and as I say, however little it is, 1, 2, 3, 4%, and can be quite a bit of money if you think about big project that's mega $1 billion, and 3 or 5% of that is also a few $1 billion. So yes, I mean, companies always look at that and say, wow, I need to spend that as on a study. But luckily, a lot of people that do projects do understand it's a very good investment. People sitting on boards that have to make the big decisions in the big state-owned enterprises, they sit there, they know that if you follow the due process and they make a decision, it's the right decision. So it's not wasted money. It's money well spent, if I can say it like that.
Okay, and then to pick your brain, what line or lines in our region really need to actually just kind of get going and get built? You must have some ideas.
Philippa, wow. Haven't you got any other easy questions?
Oh, come on. You're like, I don't know. There must be 1 or 2 lines in Africa that it's like a no-brainer. It just should just happen.
Yeah, listen, Philippa, you drive me into something, but I mean, it's not that easy. If you think about 100 years ago, certain things, and you had the visionaries that had the vision to say, listen, we need to build infrastructure in Africa. And if you look today, looking back, most of those decisions were the right decisions. The economic effects it had on the growth of the countries and the continent was enormous. But going forward, to make that decisions are not that easy, because it costs a lot of money. It's very capital intensive to build these major railway lines. But there's a lot of talk about this land bridge and the land silk and all these big railway projects in Africa. There are a lot of projects that's been on the maps for years about the big commodity type projects. Where, let's say in Guinea, there's a Simondo project that's been on the chart for so many years, so many decades, but it never gets done for various reasons. I mean, for me to say, yes, it must be done, it's going to be a very bold decisions. But I would say that the type of decisions that you need to make is where you've got a very strong backbone infrastructure railway system like South Africa. To maintain and rebuild and refurbish those lines, I think it's almost called a no-brainer. I think you need to keep that intact, because that supports a sort of growth that you can't directly measure on a daily basis. But if you look at the bigger picture of the economic growth of the country, or as I said, of the continent, at the end of the day, it's a yes. And that goes, for projects that we involve now at the moment. If you look at the North-South corridor, for instance, traversing South Africa and Zimbabwe and Zambia, if you've got a very good infrastructure in place, you will always have the freight and the opportunity to grow the economy with those type of lines. So I would say I would focus on the backbone infrastructure of each country where it makes sense, and I can think of a lot of country where it makes sense on the southern and SADC region, on the West Africa specifically, also, and even in East Africa, North Africa, yes. And then there are a few projects which will require very bold decisions, like the expansion of Gautrain, for instance, but that is built around public infrastructure and supporting that. But that goes with balance sheets and availability of funds, of course. And it's very tough times to make that decisions now, because there's subsidies involved and it's going to take out of the fiscus. So I don't want to go into specifics, but I can think of a lot of projects that must be done. But I also understand the availability of funds in these tough times to create jobs, and like we want to do now post-COVID, hopefully, if I can use that word. Then I would focus, as I say, on the backbone infrastructure to make sure it's solid and it's competitive compared to other modes, and especially on the bulk commodities where we're very competitive on rail. That should be the focus areas that we should focus on. Same for Namibia, for instance. They're refurbishing their railway line, which is their backbone infrastructure from Walvis Bay to Windhoek. They're doing it because it needs to be done. That supports the whole Trans-Kalahari railways. It supports the whole country rail system. So that is a decision I would say you must just make and do it.
I want your opinion on opening access or open access on our local rail. Do you have an opinion on that?
Yes, I've got a very good opinion on that.
I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, no, I think it should be done. There's very good examples in the world. It's very healthy. It promotes competition. It ticks all the boxes. It's not about giving away the state assets. That's not what it is. You can still maintain and keep your assets, but open up the access to that. And I think the examples that we see in the world, in Americas and other places in Europe, it's very good competition. New investment, it's very healthy competition. RSRs that look after the safety of it. You can include your economical regulators as well. And I think, it's a very good thing. So I'm a promoter of that, yes. Obviously, it must be done in a responsible manner, which obviously it's a no-brainer. I'm a promoter, and it can only be very good.
Well, I'm pleased to hear that you're a believer.
Yeah. Converted,
yay!
I'm a big promoter of doing upfront work well. That is, even if you're in a project, once you start with a project, that's of course another story. Even setting up your project once you've decided you're going to do the project is as important as doing the upfront studies for that project. And we've seen also, if project teams are not well prepared for the actual project, setting up the teams and the systems and the reporting and quality and safety and all those things within the project, it's also another disaster that's going to happen, So yes, that we can have another day about setting up a project properly.